The French resistance, French. La résistance, la small capturne d'Arles, ist letter 251-s, was a collection of groups that fought the Nazi occupation and the collaborationist Vichy regime in France during the Second World War. Resistance cells were small groups of armed men and women, called the Maquis in rural areas, 2-3, who conducted guerrilla warfare and published underground newspapers. They also provided first-hand intelligence information and escape networks that helped Allied soldiers and airmen trapped behind Axis lines. The resistance's men and women came from many parts of French society, including immigrés, academics, students, aristocrats, conservative Roman Catholics, including clergy, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, liberals, anarchists, communists, and some fascists. The proportion of the French people who participated in organized resistance has been estimated at from 1 to 3% of the total population. 4. The French resistance played a significant role in facilitating the Allies' rapid advance through France following the invasion of Normandy on 6 June 1944. Members provided military intelligence on German defenses known as the Atlantic Wall, and on Wehrmacht deployments and orders of battle for the Allies' invasion of Provence on 15 August. The resistance also planned, coordinated, and executed sabotage acts on electrical power grids, transport facilities, and telecommunications networks. 5-6. The resistance's work was politically and morally important to France during and after the German occupation. The actions of the resistance contrasted with the collaborationism of the Vichy regime. 7-8. After the Allied landings in Normandy and Provence, the paramilitary components of the resistance formed a hierarchy of operational units known as the French Forces of the Interior, FFI, with around 100,000 fighters in June 1944. By October 1944, the FFI had grown to 400,000 members. 9. Although the amalgamation of the FFI was sometimes fraught with political difficulties, it was ultimately successful and allowed France to rebuild the fourth-largest army in the European theater, 1.2 million men, by VE Day in May 1945. 10. Nazi occupation. Further information. Zone occupée and German military administration in occupied France during World War II. The cemetery and memorial in Vassia and Verkers where, in July 1944, German Wehrmacht forces executed more than 200 people in reprisal for the Maquis' armed resistance. 11-12. The town was later awarded the Ordre de la Libération. 13. Identity document of French resistance, fighter Lucien Palaiseau. After the Battle of France and the Second French-German Armistice, the lives of the French continued unchanged at first. The German occupation authorities and the Vichy regime became increasingly brutal and intimidating. Most civilians remained neutral, but both the occupation of French territory 1415 and German policy inspired the formation of paramilitary groups dedicated to both active and passive resistance. 16. One of the conditions of the armistice was that the French must pay for their own occupation. This amounted to about 20 million German Reichsmarks per day, a sum that, in May 1940, was approximately equivalent to 400 million French francs. 17. The artificial exchange rate of the Reichsmark versus the franc had been established as 1 mark to 20 francs. 1718. Due to the overvaluation of German currency, the occupiers were able to make seemingly fair and honest requisitions and purchases while operating a system of organized plunder. Prices soared. 19. Leading to widespread food shortages and malnutrition. 20. Particularly among children, the elderly and members of the working class engaged in physical labor. 21. Labor shortages also plagued the French economy because hundreds of thousands of French workers were requisitioned and transferred to Germany for compulsory labor under the Service du Travail Obligatoire STO. 222-23. The labor shortage was worsened by the large number of French prisoners of war held in Germany. 24. Beyond these hardships and dislocations, the occupation became increasingly unbearable. Regulations, censorship, propaganda, and nightly curfews all played a role in establishing an atmosphere of fear and repression. 18. French women consorting with German soldiers angered many French men, though often the women had to do so to acquire food for themselves and their families. 25-26. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane, in the Limousin region of the Massif Central. As reprisals for resistance activities, the authorities established harsh forms of collective punishment. For example, the Soviet resistance in August 1941 led to thousands of hostages taken from the population. 27. A typical policy statement read, "After each further incident, a number, reflecting the seriousness of the crime, shall be shot." 28. During the occupation, an estimated 30,000 French civilian hostages were shot to intimidate others who were involved in acts of resistance. 29. German troops occasionally engaged in massacres such as the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre, in which an entire village was razed, and almost every resident murdered because of persistent resistance in the vicinity. 30-31. In early 1943, the Vichy authorities created a paramilitary group, the militia, officially led by Pierre Laval, but operated by Joseph Darnin to combat the resistance. This group worked alongside German forces that, by the end of 1942, were stationed throughout France. 32. The group collaborated closely with the Nazis, similar to the Gestapo security forces in Germany. 33. Their actions were often brutal and included torture and execution of resistance suspects. After the liberation of France in the summer of 1944, the French executed many of the estimated 25,000 to 35,000 militias. 32 for their collaboration with the Nazis. Many of those who escaped arrest fled to Germany, where they were incorporated into the Charlemagne division of the Waffen-SS. 34. History. It has been suggested that this section be split out into a new article titled History of the French Resistance. Discuss. February 2023. The occupation was hard for the French to accept. Many Parisians remember the shock at seeing swastika flags hanging over the Hôtel de Ville and on top of the Eiffel Tower. 35. At the Palais Bourbon, where the National Assembly building was converted into the office of the Commandant von Gross-Paris. A huge banner was spread across the facade of the building reading in capital letters, Deutschland siegt and ALLEN FRONTEN. Germany is victorious on all fronts. A sign that is mentioned by virtually all accounts by Parisians at the time. 36. The racist Henry Frenay wrote about seeing the tricolor flag disappear from Paris with the swastika flag flying in its place, and German soldiers standing guard in front of buildings that once housed the institutions of the Republic gave him unsentiment de vile, a feeling of rape. 37. The British historian Ian Ausby wrote, "Even today, when people who are not French or did not live through the occupation look at photos of German soldiers marching down the Champs-Élysées or of Gothic-lettered German signposts outside the great landmarks of Paris, they can still feel a slight shock of disbelief. The scenes look not just unreal, but almost deliberately surreal, as if the unexpected conjunction of German and French, French and German, was the result of a Dada prank and not the sober record of history. This shock is merely a distant echo of what the French underwent in 1940, seeing a familiar landscape transformed by the addition of the unfamiliar, living among everyday sights suddenly made bizarre, no longer feeling at home in places they had known all their lives." 38. Ausby wrote that by the end of summer of 1940, the alien presence, increasingly hated and feared in private, could seem so permanent that, in the public places where daily life went on, it was taken for granted. 39. At the same time, buildings were renamed, books banned. Art was stolen and transferred to Germany, and people started to disappear. Under the armistice of June 1940, The French were obliged to arrest and deport to the Reich those Germans and Austrians who fled to France in the 1930s-40. Resistance, when it first began in the summer of 1940, was based upon what the writer Jean Cassou called absurd refusal, of refusing to accept that the Reich would win, and even if it did, it was better to resist. 41. Many racistants often spoke of some climax when they saw some intolerable act of injustice, after which they could no longer remain passive. 42. The racist Joseph Barthelot told the British SOE agent George Miller that he made up his mind to join the resistance when he saw German military police march a group of Frenchmen, one of whom was a friend, into the Feldgendarmerie in Metz. 42. Barthelot recalled, "I recognized him only by his hat. I saw his face all right, but there was no skin on it and he could not see me. Both his poor eyes had been closed into 2 purple and yellow bruises." 42. The right-wing racist Henry Frane, who had initially sympathized with the Révolution Nationale, stated that, when he saw German soldiers in Paris in the summer of 1940, he knew he had to do something because of the look of contempt he saw on the faces of the Germans when viewing the French. 42. In the beginning, resistance was limited to severing phone lines, vandalizing posters and slashing tires on German vehicles. 43. Another tactic was the publication of underground newspapers like Musée de l'Homme, Museum of Mankind. 44. This paper was established by 2 professors, Paul Rivet and the Russian immigré Boris Vilde, in July 1940. 45. Jean Cassou also organized a resistance group in Paris that month, and a liberal Catholic law professor, François de Menthon, founded the group Liberté in Lyon. 45. On 19 July 1940, the Special Operations Executive (SOE) was established in Britain with orders from Churchill to set Europe ablaze. 46. The F section of the SOE was headed by Maurice Buckmaster and provided invaluable support for the resistance. 46. From May 1941, Frane founded Combat, one of the first resistance groups. Frane recruited for combat by asking people such questions as whether they believed that Britain would not be defeated, and if they thought a German victory was worth stopping, and based on the answers he would ask, "Men are already gathering in the shadows. Will you join them?" 44. Frane, one of the leading resistance chefs, later wrote, "I myself never attacked a den of collaborators or derailed trains. I never killed a German or a Gestapo agent with my own hand." 43. For security reasons, Combat was divided into a series of cells that were unaware of each other. 44. Another early resistance group founded in the summer of 1940 was the ill-fated Interallié group led by a Polish immigré Roman Czerniawski that passed on intelligence from contacts in the Duxem Bureau to Britain via couriers from Marseille. A member of the group, Frenchwoman Mathilde Carré, codenamed La Chat, the Cat, was later arrested by the Germans and betrayed the group. 47. The French Intelligence Service. The Duxem Bureau stayed loyal to the Allied cause despite nominally being under the authority of Vichy. The Duxem Bureau continued to collect intelligence on Germany, maintained links with British and Polish intelligence, and kept the secret that, before World War II, Polish intelligence had devised a method via a mechanical computer known as the bomb to break the Enigma machine that was used to code German radio messages. 48. A number of the Polish code breakers who developed the bomb machine in the 1930s continued to work for the Duxem Bureau as part of the Cadix team breaking German codes. 48. In the summer of 1940, many Cheminots, railroad workers, engaged in impromptu resistance by helping French soldiers wishing to continue the struggle together with British, Belgian, and Polish soldiers stranded in France escape from the occupied zone into the unoccupied zone or Spain. 49. Cheminots also became the main agents for delivering underground newspapers across France. 49. The first racist and executed by the Germans was a Polish Jewish immigrant named Israel Karp, shot in Bordeaux on 28 August 1940 for jeering a German military parade down the streets of Bordeaux. 50. The first Frenchman shot for resistance was 19-year-old Pierre Roch on 7 September 1940 after he was caught cutting the phone lines between Royan and La Rochelle. 50. On 10 September 1940, the military governor of France, General Otto von Stülpnagel, announced in a press statement that no mercy would be granted to those engaging in sabotage, and all saboteurs would be shot. 50. Despite his warning, more continued to engage in sabotage. Louis Lallier, a farmer, was shot for sabotage on 11 September in Epinal, and Marcel Rossier, a mechanic, was shot in Rennes on 12 September. 50. One more was shot in October 1940, and 3 more in November 1940. 50. Anti-Semitic laws proclaimed in 1940. Starting in the summer of 1940, anti-Semitic laws started to come into force in both the occupied and unoccupied zones. 51. On 3 October 1940, Vichy introduced the law on the status of Jews, banning Jews from numerous professions including law, medicine, and public service. 51 Jewish businesses were Aryanized by being placed in the hands of Aryan trustees who engaged in blatant corruption. Jews were banned from cinemas, music halls, fairs, museums, libraries, public parks, cafes, theaters, concerts, restaurants, swimming pools, and markets. 52 Jews could not move without informing the police first, own radios or bicycles, were denied phone service, could not use phone booths marked Ixias Internet aux Juifs, and were only allowed to ride the last carriage on the Paris metro. 53. The French people at the time distinguished between Israelites, a polite term in French, who were properly assimilated French Jews, and the Juifs, formerly a derogatory term in French, nowadays the standard name for Jewish people, who were the foreign and unassimilated Jews who were widely seen as criminals from abroad living in slums in the inner cities of France. 54. All through the 1930s, the number of illegal Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe was vastly exaggerated. The French public was persuaded that the majority of Jews living in France were illegal immigrants causing social problems. 55. When the first anti-Semitic laws were introduced in 1940, there was no sign of public opposition to what was happening, or even widespread unease at the direction in which events were heading. Many people, perhaps even most people, were indifferent. In the autumn of 1940, they had other things to think about. Later, they could find little room for fellow feeling or concern for the public good in their own struggle to survive. What happened to the Jews was a secondary matter. It was beyond their immediate affairs. It belonged to that realm of the political, which they could no longer control or even bring themselves to follow with much interest. 56. From the beginning, the resistance attracted people from all walks of life and with diverse political views. 42. A major problem for the resistance was that, with the exception of a number of army officers who chose to go underground together with veterans of the Spanish Civil War, nobody had any military experience. 57. About 60,000 Spanish Republican exiles fought in the resistance. 46. A further difficulty was the shortage of weapons, which explained why early resistance groups founded in 1940 focused on publishing journals and underground newspapers, as the lack of guns and ammunition made armed resistance almost impossible. 58. Although officially adhering to the Comintern instructions not to criticize Germany because of the Soviet non-aggression pact with Hitler, in October 1940, the French Communists founded the Special Organization, OS, composed with many veterans from the Spanish Civil War, which carried out a number of minor attacks before Hitler broke the treaty and invaded Russia. 59. Life in the resistance was highly dangerous, and it was imperative for good resistance to live quietly and never attract attention to themselves. 60. Punctuality was key to meetings in public, as the Germans would arrest anyone who was seen hanging around in public as if waiting for A major difficulty for the resistance was the problem of denunciation. 62. Contrary to popular belief, the Gestapo was not an omnipotent agency with its spies everywhere, but instead the Gestapo relied upon ordinary people to volunteer information. According to Abwehr officer Hermann Tickler, the Germans needed 32 indicateurs, informers, to crush all resistance in France, but he reported in the fall of 1940 that the Abwehr had already exceeded that target. 62. It was difficult for Germans to pass themselves off as French, so the Abwehr, the Gestapo, and the SS could not have functioned without French informers. In September 1940, the poet Robert Desnos published an article titled Guerrilla le dire à la commandanter in the underground newspaper Aujourd'hui, appealing to ordinary French people to stop denouncing each other to the Germans. 43. Desnos's appeal failed. But the phrase Guerrilla le dire à la commandanter, I'll go and tell the Germans about it, was a very popular one in occupied France as hundreds of thousands of ordinary French people denounced one another to the Germans. 62. The problem of informers, whom the French called indics or mouches, was compounded by the writers of poison pen letters or corbeaux. 62. These corbeaux were inspired by motivations such as envy, spite, greed, anti-Semitism, and sheer opportunism. As many ordinary French people wanted to ingratiate themselves with what they believed to be the winning side. 63. Ausby noted, yet perhaps the most striking testimony to the extent of denunciation came from the Germans themselves, surprised at how ready the French were to betray each other. 64. In occupied France, one had to carry at all times a huge cache of documents such as an ID card, a ration card, tobacco voucher, regardless if one was a smoker or not. Travel permits, work permits, and so on. 61. For these reasons, forgery became a key skill for the resistance as the Germans regularly required the French to produce their papers, and anyone whose papers seemed suspicious would be arrested. 61. As the franc was devalued by 20% to the Reichsmark, which together with German policies of food requisition both to support their own army and the German home front, France was slowly being bled dry by the outflow not just of meat and drink, fuel and leather, but of wax, frying pans, playing cards, axe handles, perfume, and a host of other goods as well. Parisians, at least, had got the point as early as December 1940. When Hitler shipped back the Duc de Reichstadt's remains for a solemn burial in Les Invalides, people said they would have preferred coal rather than ashes. 65 people could not legally buy items without a ration book, with the population being divided into categories A, B, C, E, J, T, and V. Among the products rationed included meat, milk, butter, cheese, bread, sugar, eggs, oil, coffee, fish, wine, soap, tobacco, salt, potatoes, and clothing. 66. The black market flourished in occupied France with the gangsters from the milieu, underworld of Paris and Marseille soon becoming very rich by supplying rationed goods. 67. The milieu established smuggling networks bringing in rationed goods over the Pyrenees from Spain, and it was soon learned that for the right price. They were also willing to smuggle people out of France like Allied airmen, refugees, Jews, and resistants. Later on in the war, they would smuggle in agents from the SO. 67, however, the milieu were only interested in making money, and would just as easily betray those who wanted to be smuggled in or out of France if the Germans or Vichy were willing to make a better offer. 67. On 10 November 1940, a jostle on the Rue de Havre in Paris broke out between some Parisians and German soldiers, which ended with a man raising his fist to a German sergeant, and which led to a man named Jacques Bonsergent, who seems only to have been a witness to the quarrel, being arrested in unclear circumstances. 50. On 11 November 1940, to mark the 22nd anniversary of the French victory of 1918, university students demonstrated in Paris and were brutally put down by the Paris police. 68. In December 1940, the Organisation Civile et Militaire (OCM), which consisted of army officers and civil servants, was founded to provide intelligence to the Allies. 48. On 5 December 1940, Bonsergent was convicted by a German military court of insulting the Wehrmacht. He insisted on taking full responsibility, saying he wanted to show the French what sort of people the Germans were, and he was shot on 23 December 1940. 50. The execution of Bonsergent, a man guilty only of being a witness to an incident that was in itself only very trivial, brought home to many of the French the precise nature of the new order in Europe. 69. All over Paris. Posters warning that all who challenged the might of the Reich would be shot like Bonsergent were torn down or vandalized, despite the warnings from General von Stülpnagel that damaging the posters was an act of sabotage that would be punished by the death penalty. So many posters were torn down and or vandalized that Stülpnagel had to post policemen to guard them. 70. Writer Jean Bruller remembered being transfixed by reading about Bonsergent's fate and how people stopped, wordlessly exchanged glances. Some of them bared their heads as if in the presence of the dead. 70. On Christmas Day 1940, Parisians woke to find that in the previous night, the posters announcing Bonsergent's execution had been turned into shrines, being, in Bruller's words, surrounded by flowers, like on so many tombs. Little flowers of every kind mounted on pins had been struck on the posters during the night, real flowers and artificial ones, paper pansies, celluloid roses, small French and British flags. 70. The writer Simone de Beauvoir stated that it was not just Bonsergent that people mourned, but also the end of the illusion, as for the first time these correct people who occupied our country were officially telling us they had executed a Frenchman guilty of not bowing his head to them. 70. 1941. Armed resistance begins. On 31 December 1940, de Gaulle, speaking on the BBC's Radio Landers, asked that the French stay indoors on New Year's Day between 3 and 4:00 p.m. as a show of passive resistance. 70. The Germans handed out potatoes at that hour in an attempt to bring people away from their radios. 70. In March 1941, the Calvinist pastor Mark Bogner condemned the Vichy Statute des Juifs in a public letter, one of the first times that French antisemitism had been publicly condemned during the occupation. 71. On 5 May 1941, the first SOE agent, Georges Béguet, landed in France to make contact with the resistance groups. Virginia Hall was the first female SOE agent arriving in August 1941. The SOE preferred to recruit French citizens living in Britain or who had fled to the United Kingdom, as they were able to blend in more effectively. British SOE agents were people who had lived in France for a long time and could speak French without an accent. Béguet suggested that the BBC's Radio Landers send personal messages to the resistance. At 9:15 p.m. every night, the BBC's French-language service broadcast the first 4 notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which sounded like the Morse code for V as in victory, followed by cryptic messages, which were codes for the personal messages to the resistance. 72. By June 1941, the SOE had 2 radio stations operating in France. 73. The SOE provided weapons, bombs, false papers, money and radios to the resistance. And the SOE agents were trained in guerrilla warfare, espionage and sabotage. One such SOE operative, American Virginia Hall, established the Heckler Network in Lyon. 74. A major reason for young Frenchmen to become racistants was resentment of collaboration horizontal collaboration, the euphemistic term for sexual relationships between German men and Frenchwomen. 25. The devaluation of the franc and the German policy of requisitioning food created years of hardship for the French, so taking a German lover was a rational choice for many Frenchwomen. Horizontal collaboration was widespread, with 85,000 illegitimate children fathered by Germans born by October 1943. 75. While this number isn't particularly high for the circumstances, many young Frenchmen disliked the fact that some Frenchwomen seemed to find German men more attractive than them and wanted to strike back. 75. In Britain, the letter V had been adopted as a symbol of the will to victory, and in the summer of 1941, the V cult crossed the English Channel, and the letter V appeared widely in chalk on the pavement, walls, and German military vehicles all over France. 76V remained one of the main symbols of resistance for the rest of the occupation, although Auspy has noted that the French had their own revolutionary, republican, and nationalist traditions to draw upon for symbols of resistance. 77. Starting in 1941, it was common for crowds to sing La Marseillaise on traditional holidays like May Day, Bastille Day, 6 September, the anniversary of the Battle of the Marne in 1914, and Armistice Day with a special emphasis on the line, Aux armes, citoyens. Citizens to arms. 78. The underground press created what Auspy called the rhetoric of resistance to counter the rhetoric of the Reich and Vichy to inspire people, using sayings from the great figures of French history. 79. The underground newspaper Les Petites Ailes de France Fr. quoted Napoleon that to live defeated is to die every day. Liberté quoted Foch that a nation is beaten only when it has accepted that it is beaten, while Combat quoted Clemenceau. In war as in peace, those who never give up have the last word. 79. The two most popular figures invoked by the resistance were Clemenceau and Maréchal Foch, who insisted even during the darkest hours of World War I that France would never submit to the Reich and would fight on until victory, which made them inspiring figures to the resistance. 79. On 22 June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. 59. Well prepared for the resistance through the clandestinity in which they were forced during the Daladier government, the Parti Communiste Français, PCF, began fighting German occupation forces in May 1941, i.e. before the Comintern appeal that followed the German attack to the Soviet Union. 80. Nevertheless, Communists had a more prominent role in the resistance only after June 1941. 59.